Jasmine Washington sat silently in her car outside the courthouse, staring at the small piece of paper in her hand. It was a traffic ticket, a violation of the kind that most people in Georgia would find trivial. But this one had changed her life. It was the day she saw something she couldn't ignore, something that would alter the course of her career and, ultimately, the state's judicial system. The ticket had come from Judge Richard Whitmore's traffic court, a place where Jasmine had once witnessed a public defender, Lisa Chun, struggle to make her voice heard as her client, a black man, was treated with contempt by the judge. It wasn't just about the fine that was imposed or the harsh words spoken. It was the underlying systemic bias that was painfully evident. For Jasmine, this was just the beginning of a much larger problem. As Jasmine took her first steps into the world of court reform, she couldn't shake the memory of that morning. She had always been diligent, meticulous in her work as a clerk. But this case, and many like it, stood out. Judge Whitmore, known for his strict, almost draconian approach to traffic cases, had become notorious in the community. The public defenders had begun to notice the disparities, and they had started talking. Word spread fast, and soon, Jasmine's meticulous attention to detail was put to the test. Weeks passed, and the more Jasmine dug, the more disturbing the patterns became. It wasn't just about one judge or one court. It was a much larger systemic issue. Defendants of color were routinely fined more heavily, and often, their cases were dismissed or handled with far less leniency than their white counterparts. The numbers were staggering. African Americans were paying, on average, 320% more in fines, and Hispanics paid 280% more. This was no coincidence. It was institutionalized prejudice that had infiltrated every level of the court system. Jasmine, with the help of Marcus, a data analyst, began to piece together the puzzle. They collected thousands of case files, analyzed sentencing patterns, and studied the court's tone, demeanor, and treatment of defendants. When the media caught wind of what Jasmine was uncovering, the situation exploded. The case was no longer confined to Judge Whitmore's courtroom. It had become a national scandal. Mrs. Rodriguez, the grandmother from Lisa Chen's case, held a sign outside the courthouse reading, "Justice shouldn't see color." It was clear that people were watching, and the pressure mounted. By the end of the week, a class action lawsuit had been filed against the state, accusing the judicial system of racial bias. The Department of Justice stepped in, launching a formal investigation into the practices at Georgia's lower courts. Jasmine was thrust into the spotlight, with reporters questioning her every move. Yet, even as the investigation deepened, Jasmine remained focused. She had seen enough. She knew that this wasn't about just one judge. It was about the system itself. The day she received a text from Judge Carter, a seasoned judge who supported her efforts, was a turning point. He told her the news. Whitmore had requested early retirement. But Jasmine understood that would never be enough. The system had to change. Jasmine sat alone in her office that night, the weight of her work pressing down on her. The evidence she had gathered was overwhelming. The tapes, the transcripts, the data. It was all right in front of her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to uncover. She reviewed the footage of Judge Whitmore's courtroom, frame by frame. The casual dismissals, the subtle shifts in tone when dealing with defendants of color. It was all there. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the reality of a biased system. The next morning, Jasmine found herself standing before the Judicial Qualifications Commission, prepared to present her findings. The tension in the room was palpable. On the other side sat Judge Whitmore, his legal team in tow, prepared to defend his record. Jasmine's voice was steady as she outlined the data, presenting the staggering numbers that reflected a pattern of systemic racial discrimination. The room buzzed with murmurs as she laid out case after case of disparate sentencing, each example reinforcing her argument. Whitmore's attorneys tried to deflect, questioning the methodology, but Jasmine was ready. She played the audio recordings from the court, highlighting Whitmore's words as he addressed black defendants with contempt while offering leniency to white offenders. Lisa Chun took the stand next, her voice shaky but firm as she recounted her experience with Judge Whitmore. She described the subtle cues like the tapping of Whitmore's pen, a signal that the defendants in front of him were to be treated with suspicion. Whitmore's reaction to Lisa's testimony was telling. Gone was the confident, dismissive judge from the traffic court. Instead, he was small, defensive, and rattled. Jasmine pressed him on the disparity in sentencing between two similar cases, one involving a white woman, the other a black man. Whitmore's feeble response was that he couldn't recall the details. But Jasmine had the evidence, the audio recordings that spoke volumes. By the end of the hearing, the decision was unanimous. Judge Whitmore was immediately suspended, pending a full investigation into his conduct. The media coverage was relentless, but Jasmine remained focused. This was a moment of victory, but she knew the work was just beginning. As the case gained national attention, the Department of Justice launched its own investigation into systemic bias in the courts. In the months that followed, reforms were enacted across the state. A three-pronged approach to eliminating bias was proposed: mandatory bias training for all judicial officers, statistical reviews of sentencing patterns, and the establishment of independent oversight committees to ensure accountability. These measures, spearheaded by Jasmine, were implemented with remarkable success, reducing racial disparities in traffic court by 67% within the first year. But the most profound shift occurred when Judge Whitmore, having faced public scrutiny and the collapse of his career, was offered a chance at redemption. Instead of remaining bitter or defensive, Whitmore chose to collaborate with Jasmine. He became a key figure in the newly formed Judicial Bias Training Initiative, where he helped other judges confront their own prejudices. His transformation was a powerful testament to the potential for change, even in the most entrenched systems. 6 months into the program, Jasmine attended one of Whitmore's training sessions. She watched as he used his own behavior to teach others about the subtle ways bias can manifest in the courtroom. Listening to his voice crack as he acknowledged his past mistakes, Jasmine realized that change wasn't just about fixing individual cases. It was about changing the hearts and minds of those who held power. Whitmore's candid admission of his biases, paired with the data Jasmine had collected, became a model for judicial education nationwide. The work didn't stop there. Jasmine continued to press for reforms, traveling across the country to advocate for similar initiatives in other states. Her efforts culminated in the landmark case Washington versus Georgia Judicial System, a nationwide challenge to discriminatory practices in the court system. By this time, the Washington Protocol, the training program Jasmine had helped create, had become the standard for judicial reform. Jasmine's journey, which had started with a simple traffic ticket, had grown into a national movement. At the Supreme Court hearing, Jasmine presented her case with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. The justices listened intently as she presented the evidence from Georgia, showing that the disparities in sentencing weren't isolated to one court or one state. They were a nationwide problem. Jasmine's proposal, mandatory bias training for all judges, regular statistical reviews, and independent oversight, was met with serious consideration. By the end of the hearing, the justices had made it clear that judicial bias training would become a national mandate. States across the country began to implement similar reforms, and Jasmine's work became a blueprint for change. Back in Georgia, the results of the reforms were evident in the dramatically reduced racial disparities in sentencing. Defendants of all races were now treated more equally in the courts. In a small celebration after the ruling, Jasmine was joined by Marcus and her team. They toasted to their success, but Jasmine knew that the work was far from over. The reforms had made a difference, but there was still much more to be done. As she reflected on her journey, from that fateful day in traffic court to the halls of the Supreme Court, Jasmine understood that the fight for justice was not a destination, but an ongoing journey. The revolution that had started with a single traffic ticket had grown into a movement for change that would continue to evolve, transforming the judicial system one case at a time. And in the years to come, as Jasmine continued her work to ensure that every person in the courtroom was treated fairly, she would always remember the words of Maria Santos, the cleaning woman who had lost her house. Her letter had said it all. Sometimes the greatest justice comes not from punishment, but from transformation. The work was just beginning, and Jasmine knew the road ahead would be long. But as long as she had the courage to fight, she would continue to change the system, one case at a time.